everyone to today's webinar, Hospital Social Media Marketing, Leaders and Laggards. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'll walk us through a few quick housekeeping instructions. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. If at any time you don't see your slides moving or have trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We're here to help. With that, I am pleased to introduce today's speakers. Danny Flamberg, VP of Strategy HCP at LiveWorld, and Johanna Skillings, former CSO at Ogilvy Health. Danny Flamberg oversees LiveWorld's healthcare provider practice, helping clients develop marketing strategies for healthcare and life science brands. He has over 20 years of healthcare marketing experience, including 7 years as EVP, Managing Director of Digital and CRM at Publis. Prior to joining Publis, he led the digital transformation of Juice Pharma Advertising. His digital experience also includes tenure as Vice President of Global Marketing at SAP, SVP Managing Director at Gizitas, and a CMO of Cellular One. Danny earned an AB, an MA, and PhD in econometrics at Columbia University. Johanna Skilling is a healthcare marketing consultant and former Chief Strategy Officer for major healthcare advertising agencies, including Saatchi Wellness, Havas Links, and Ogilvy Health. Johanna has unique insight into marketing trends and best practices for big pharma, emerging biotechs, and hospital systems of all sizes. Johanna's academic credentials include degrees from Tufts University, NYU, and a certificate in narrative medicine from Columbia University. She has served as an adjunct professor at NYU since 2002, teaching strategic planning and healthcare marketing. Johanna and Danny, thank you so much for being here today. Danny, I'll turn the floor over to you so you can get us started.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you and welcome everybody. Today's session was really prompted by some old-fashioned advice I got from my father. And a lot of the clients I worked on in that flattering bio were clients that didn't have the most resources, didn't have the biggest teams, were second or third or fourth to the market. And my father always found me whining about this. And he said to me at one point, you know what? In a competitive market, it's always smart to follow the smart money and track what the well-heeled guys are doing, because inevitably they know stuff you don't know. They're doing stuff you can't do, but there's a lot you can learn from them, and there's a lot that you can adapt and align from the things they're doing. So that idea animated this session. And with that in mind, I reached out to my friend, NYU Professor Johanna Skilling, who A, is among the smartest people I know, and B, who did a deep dive into what leading hospitals are doing in social media, with this idea that we can learn from them and that we can benefit by understanding their strategy and adopt it to us. I want to make a quick caveat here, which is social media, in our understanding, is a pay-for-play medium. One of the things that you will learn in the next few minutes is the issue of strategy, the issue of direction, the issue of best practices, the issue of creative. What you won't hear is data about media planning and spending. We didn't do a deep dive in that area. We did a deep dive in terms of strategy, content, and audience targeting. So with that caveat, let's advance to the next slide. What you're going to see today is a view from the 30,000 feet up. We're going to present an enormous amount of detailed information. We looked at this by organization. We looked at this by channel. We looked at this by interaction with audiences. So you're going to hear a lot of complex information. If you find that this is useful, and if you want us to present this material to your team, or if you want to have a consultation with us to see how the insights from this webinar might apply to your brand planning or to your strategy, all you have to do is ping us. So with that 30,000 feet, next slide, please. we're going to jump into a look at the different top leading communities and top leading hospitals. Johanna, what was your methodology in studying this hospital landscape?
Well, Danny, it's kind of the wisdom of your dad, even though I didn't know that till after I did this. But the U.S. News & World Report of Best Hospitals ranking is really pretty influential. And to your point about what do the top hospitals by revenue and patient count do, thought it would be instructive to see how they react in social media, and to your point, what lessons the rest of us can take from it in the 4 major consumer social media channels. So what we did is take a look. We started off just looking at the raw numbers, right? So you see the U.S. News ranking to the left and the hospital name, and then you see who's doing what. And the first thing that jumps out is not everybody is doing everything. And we're going to talk in a lot more detail about each channel. What you will also see as we go through that social media sometimes rewards the big players, but often rewards people punching above their weight. So smaller hospital systems can get bigger results. There are also some big opportunities that the big guys are not taking. You're going to see in Insta and TikTok in particular, as well as opportunities in the bigger channels like Facebook and Twitter that are still wide open for other people to jump in.
Johanna, what's the goal? I'm looking at the different numbers of followers and people connected to these hospitals. Is this evidencing some movement that hospital marketers are moving from transactional relationships to ongoing, continuing relationships?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because with competition, with burgeoning healthcare needs, with telemedicine, traditional brick and mortar hospitals and hospital systems really need to find a way to people's lives and become an ongoing part. And what a lot of hospitals are doing with social is connecting with patients and potential patients all along the life cycle. And we'll look at different ways they do that, whether it's from young people or young families to older, more traditional healthcare consumers like older individuals. But there's no question
so it would appear then that these platforms are not homogenous or ubiquitous, that you can go after different segments using these platforms in the way that you would do it with other media. Am I understanding that right?
You are. And the different channels, I think it's going to be obvious to everybody here, different channels do appeal to different audiences to some extent. And it's also a question of content and what you're saying and how you're connecting with influencers, all of which we'll talk about.
So are there best practices that you've identified?
Funny you should ask. We didn't rehearse this, guys. So it's top 10 practices. So what you'll see in aggregate, and we'll talk about each channel in particular, you see a lot of them are shared. And then you see a few that are specific. So frequency is big. We'll talk about that a lot. Top hospitals may post every hour, which is not achievable for everybody, but gives us kind of a gold standard. Content mix, there's always a content mix about medical wellness and community, assuming that's best practice. Some people may lean harder on one or the other, and that tends to depress things. Being mindful of what's happening in the news, what's topical, like right now there's a big heat wave in huge swaths of the world. How to stay safe in a heat wave is coming up a lot in hospital-related content. Spotlight on doctors, offering guidance on the health needs they specialize in. Hashtags, when they're used well, terrific. When they're not used well or not used, that can be a miss. The best hospitals or the top performing ones have brand alignment across all their communications platforms, which sounds kind of obvious.
So this is the idea that no matter where you go, you encounter their look and feel, you know who they are, you immediately find some affinity for them. Is that the idea?
You know them immediately, absolutely. And then where there's a call to action button, there is often a lot of creative ways to use it. So those hospitals that have kind of gone beyond the obvious have found some really interesting ways to connect with their audiences. Facebook has a ton of features that once you start exploring, you see some of the top, more successful hospitals are using more of them. Curating a range of stories, that should be true for Instagram as well. And then on Instagram and Twitter in particular, you could do it elsewhere, but this is where it thrives, is multiple accounts. for either specialized practices or locations or connecting with special doctors who specialize. So a ton of really great things going on.
So if there's this list of 10 best practices, we know we're talking about leaders and laggards. Is there a list of some not so best practices?
There certainly are. So kind of the corollary to what we just spoke about, right? There are some hospitals that kind of drop off in a lack of visual or brand distinction. So what colors they use, what logos they use, what language they use, what photography they use, not consistent. And to your point, Danny, then that relationship gets kind of frayed between different social channels. The lack of brand alignment between channels, where you can go from one place to the other and it might look very different. Channels with data to no content, there are more than a few of these big hospitals that have opened an account, and maybe they do it for paid social, but it's a miss because you search for Hospital X on Facebook or Instagram, and you get a gray screen with no content, and it just looks like they're not paying attention. And what we saw in the very first slide, we kind of glossed over it, 80% of consumers look at social as an indication of how forward-thinking and relationship-minded hospitals are. So having those empty accounts or no content is a real miss.
So the audience expects you to be there and expects you to be able to, and expects to be able to recognize you right away.
Yes, and we live in a world more and more where we all expect everybody to be everywhere. Every brand we interact with, no matter what kind of consumer we are, if we look for it, we want to see it. We're looking for it for a reason. So the fourth point here is content that's more about the hospital. There's some systems that do a little too much chest beating. And of course, hospital content it's the key thing, but in the context of patients and patient relationships and patient care. Poor follow-through on social signals. So I mentioned hashtags can be terrific, but if you put out a hashtag like one of our major hospitals does and never use it again, you've wasted the real estate of the hashtag. And finally, not curating third-party posts and responses. This is a commitment, and it's a fair amount of work. But unfortunately, if you don't do it, other people start taking over the conversation. And we all know there are a lot of trolls and mischief makers out there, or even people who just want to make their own point at your expense. So we're seeing that happen more than it should, and it's a good watch out.
Should that also be a impetus to do careful moderation and monitoring of your social platforms?
Absolutely. And this is where I said it is a lot of work and it takes a lot of attention, but it's very much worth curating that relationship and that brand profile.
So let's talk channels. We know that different channels have different attributes. As you were saying, Facebook has an enormous number of functionalities, many of which I don't know about or are brought to me by our liaison people that, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea that they could do that. The flip side, of course, is that they're constantly changing. They're not particularly friendly to advertisers. They tend to pull the rug out from under us. In the old days, we all amassed these large number of followers organically, and then they closed the door on that and said, you've got to pay to get access to the people that you attracted to the platform. So there's a fair amount of skepticism about Facebook, which is kind of the big dog.
Well, as you said, but Facebook is still the major place where people go to play. And is that because they've been around the longest? Probably. Is it because people feel the most comfortable? Most definitely. Is it because social media and marketing managers who may not be digital natives have the most personal comfort with Facebook? Probably. So let's look at what's going on.
It's almost like the old idea that you can't go wrong by hiring IBM because it's the gold standard. You can't go wrong by focusing on Facebook because it's the gold standard.
You got it. Exactly right. And it has massive reach. And there is also the bias, and it's not untrue, that Facebook attracts as older consumers at this point on average, and older consumers are the ones who need more health care. So there are nuances to that too, of course, especially for hospitals that serve all ages. But let's take a look what's happening here just on Facebook with our top 10. Cleveland Clinic beat out Mayo Clinic as the #1 spot. We'll talk about why. And I talk about hospitals punching above their weight. Our number 9 on the U.S. News and World Report is actually number 4 on Facebook. And a lot of that has to do with frequency and content. So let's talk a little bit about what we see here. You see almost 2 million followers for Cleveland Clinic. This may not be something everybody is prepared to commit to, but they post hourly. Now that can be done on an automated basis, as we all know, but it's a big commitment in terms of content. They also use that call to action button very creatively. So you see that Mayo, our number 1 hospital, uses the default learn more, but everybody else has thought about other ways to use that real estate. So donate, because they're not for profit. Contact, call now, see another donate. Book now, book an appointment. So Cedar Sinai and NYU Langone use that space very, very creatively to get that engagement right on the money. And that's something anybody listening can do now, is change that CTA to something much more direct. So there's something that we wanted to look at. We talked before about brand and being distinct. First impressions count. So this is kind of an amalgam of the tiles on top of the account, the way we all have them. And the first thing you notice is there's a lot of lookalike. So the top 10 hospitals, you see purple, you see blue. Where there's something to say in terms of number 1 hospital, number 6, number 1 in California, certainly they take advantage of that. But only one really is about the patient, and that's Cleveland Clinic, our number 1 pick on Facebook. Early detection can save your life. They rotate the style, they rotate the message, and it's always about patient care. So everybody else is kind of self-centered. Stay amazing, maybe you could make an argument that's for patients as well. But really, in terms of being health-centric, we're looking straight at you, Cleveland Clinic. And they take full advantage of Facebook features. So they have that specific CTA we talked about, a really nice mix of wellness content and medical content. So you see quizzes and pictures of patients and different kinds of areas that people can be interested in, whether it's high science, high medical, or true or false about coffee. Invites interaction with those videos and quizzes and events. And this is pretty interesting. If you go into Facebook events, they allow the public to create their own fundraisers to benefit Cleveland Clinic. So they can have happy patients or families saying, I want to contribute something back, I want to give something back, and they make that possible right from Facebook. Now we talked about demographics, so they do their homework to focus on key targets. So there's some good information out there that 30% of hospital visits by 25 to 34-year-olds are maternity related. So Cleveland Clinic, without saying, we're looking at you, pregnant people, they make content available for that 30%. So when that person is thinking about getting pregnant with their next child or what have you, they're starting to be primed to think about Cleveland Clinic for their maternity needs.
But here's one of the Facebook challenges in terms of targeting. So last year, we could target people by discrete disease. We could target HCPs by specialty. All that targeting on Facebook has been eliminated. So we need to be more innovative. We need to be clever in terms of what data we use and how we match the data to Facebook's database to really zero in on these conditions. So that on one hand, it has the opportunity to do segmented marketing. On the other hand, it's a challenge to get the targeting right.
It is, and it's a little bit of like broadcast, old-fashioned broadcast at this point, which is ironic, but it also means that when you cast that wide net, if you do it often enough, as they do with their frequency of posting, you could put in a lot of content to a lot of different types of people to reach a big cross-section. And it's not just generic health messages. It's specific to a certain group of people. And maternity could be, think maternity, think cardiology, think, any kind of disease state or need, pediatric, that we can add to that content strategy. So we didn't just want to talk about the big guys. We wanted to make this a little more relatable for everybody who's not Cleveland Clinic or Mayo Clinic. So meanwhile, in Buffalo, New York, we've got a place called Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, which does an absolutely terrific job on Facebook in a much smaller catchment area and a much smaller hospital. And sorry about that. Let me go back and just talk about that visual for a second. They talk about their community a lot. They do a lot of events. They post before the event, from the event, after the event. They really involve their patients. They focus on, if you look at that lower left hand, they focus on patient success stories almost every day, if not a couple times a day. And they focus on the doctors in the context of that patient care. Very human-centric, very externally centric, so they're not really talking about themselves. And they are rewarded by their community with engagement.
So let's look and see what we can learn from Facebook. I mean, I think the overwhelming answers are that we need to understand and utilize the features and functions, and we need to do the content mix in a way that appeals to different segments. The real question I have, though, is will Facebook continue to dominate? We know that they've been under attack both in the UK and in the US. We know that Zuckerberg wants to bring Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, and WhatsApp integrated more together. We know that there's political issues. We know there's moderation issues. We know that this whole question of who's responsible for hate speech on these platforms. So there's a lot of kind of potentially difficult challenges for Facebook. What do you think the outlook is?
Facebook is like any giant. It's going to go through its ups and downs. You mentioned IBM. IBM certainly took a big decline. They had to change their business model after Apple and everybody else started coming in with laptops. They missed the boat on that. And now IBM has sort of settled into not a giant, but sort of a mid-tier services company. They haven't made hardware for a long time, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows. Facebook will probably go through a similar cycle. It's almost too big to fail and go away. It potentially will be more regulated, although there's not necessarily a lot of appetite for regulation in the US. There certainly is in Europe. And there are other channels, as we're about to talk about, and ones that haven't been invented. So putting all of our eggs in the basket of Facebook is probably not a great idea for all the reasons you said.
So let's move on to Twitter, which is another platform which we know HCPs have rallied to in a very big way. We also know that however the Elon Musk issue is resolved will probably affect the functionality and the features of the platform. The whole question of bots and fake accounts has already in some cases given us hesitation in terms of looking at this channel. But it has some incredible attributes. So talk to us about that.
Well, what's interesting here is that, again, 8 out of 10 of our hospitals are on Twitter, even though it has arguably smaller consumer audiences. It's definitely big on HCP, and it's really for news-hungry people. And so they're the people looking for the latest and the quickest and what they'll see before the headlines hit anywhere else. Now, here you see Mayo and Cleveland have switched places. But again, you've got companies punching above their weight, such as Johns Hopkins, which would be 4, and here it's 3, again, USCF Medical Center and Mass General. And you see that, again, frequency is a big deal. This is number of tweets is partly a reflection of how long they've been on the platform, which, of course, the longer you've been somewhere, the more you accrete in terms of content and followers. Let's look a little deeper. So, again, Mayo has a very strong community and patient orientation. Number 1 hospital is not something the rest of us can really replicate, but I love their tagline. It says, you know where to go. So it implies, or we can infer, that we're smart, we know something, and we already know who Mayo is. And here again, you see a big mix between, professional-looking content and wellness and patients and science. And so they're not just, sticking with one topic. It's relevant, it's visual, lots and lots of call to actions.
And the guiding tool there would be the hashtags?
Hashtags and this, multiple Twitter accounts. So where Mayo really excels is, and this is just a partial list, by the way, you see the Mayo Clinic, but you also see Mayo Clinic Health System, Mayo Clinic Labs, Mayo Clinic Med Ed, Mayo Clinic Maine, Mayo Clinic News. It goes on and on with different specialties. And what that allows them to do is repost from all of these different accounts. They cross-post. So not all the content is identical, but it winds up being meshed in the end. So people who subscribe to one feed get to see the content from all the others. And that really raises the bar in terms of how aware people are of them and the amount of content they're able to see.
Right, but they must have an enormous team to be able to crank out this content at the frequency that you've already shown us.
They probably do. We didn't look into the size of their team, but it's a replicable strategy in that in a smaller hospital, if there's a doctor already tweeting, if there's a nurse already tweeting, if there's a specialty unit, whether it's public affairs or cancer care already tweeting, the trick is to hashtag and cross-post between anybody related to that hospital system. If you have multiple locations, 2 locations across town or within a certain city, all of those things can work together so that you're strengthening your base.
So on a strategy level, you would recommend that a hospital align with and make connections with and cross-post with some of the HCPs or some of the specialists or some of the department heads that have their own accounts. Am I understanding that right?
Every time. Every time. Now, there may be a concern about, is the doctor posting either relevant information or approved information, and that's an agreement that can happen behind the scenes. And then in addition, they'll retweet. So there's often a fear, I find, and this is not just true of hospital systems, but really any healthcare account because of regulatory concerns. They'll retweet frequently from third-party sources as well as, I mentioned, its own subsidiary account. And so you see things from different newspaper sources or different accounts from other people, all health-related. And in terms of regulatory issues, either they have somebody internally who scrubs them, or because it's third-party content that is already on Twitter, they're simply resharing. But they're, again, adding relevance to what they're saying with, gee, there's an article in the Telegraph. This happens to be about last year's heat wave. It's kind of prescient for right now, or seasonal. And then they can add a few thoughts about, gee, what should you do about it? And here's a hashtag, or here's another link to go to. But they add relevance to their own content and who they are. And again, when we're talking about patient relationships, they're bringing information that patients might not otherwise see. So again, you said big resources, big money. And to your dad's point, you don't have to be a big hospital to do Twitter well. So Indianapolis University Health does a great job on Twitter showcasing patients' humanity. And they basically show patient stories over and over and over again. And it's related to their healthcare stories with IU. But you get to see yourself, whether as an athlete or as an older couple or as a new mom, whatever it happens to be, and you're seeing yourself in this place relating to IU and thinking, gee, they did well there, maybe I can too.
So there are substantial learnings that we can get from Twitter. Obviously, to your last point, focus on patients in the community, frequency. You want to think of it in a news kind of context. You want to look at the potential for those multiple accounts, and you want to see if it makes sense to coordinate, align, and sync up with the HCPs in your universe. And of course, to this last point, retweeting is a standard behavior on Twitter. It's expected, and you shouldn't be fearful of it. You should embrace it in terms of content, in terms of strategy, and in terms of targeting. Well, the next channel is Instagram, which took off like a rocket, which we think of as highly visual, which has grown enormously and now is being cross-pollinated with Facebook. Reels and those kinds of things are happening. Well, what's going on in Instagram?
Well, Instagram, kind of surprisingly, is only 50% of our hospital's channel. So again, big opportunity for others. In a way, it's surprising because it is tied so closely to Facebook. And Danny, you just said it. A lot of new products being rolled out on Facebook are happening simultaneously on Instagram. That's been happening more and more in the last year to 18 months and will continue as they kind of collapse their services more. And again, you see frequency as an issue. Again, you see Mayo and Cleveland kind of, fighting it out for the top spot. New York Presbyterian, interestingly, comes up from the bottom of the U.S. News rankings to be our number 3. Mass General is a little higher as well. So what do they do right? Here you see the active presence. And the reason that we're looking at this is to show you what a non-active presence looks like. So you look at the top 5 or 6, and then you look at the bottom, and you can see, this is what we're talking about at the top of the hour. You can see that there are some posts there, but they're not by the hospital. And you can see some, there are no posts at all, or just a geographic marker. And this is a miss, because in terms of relationships, in terms of starting with people, especially Instagram, somewhat younger people, maybe in their 30s and 40s, as opposed to their 50s and 60s, this is where you're starting to get traction with people who are looking for a more permanent healthcare relationship with hospitals. And the way insurance works and HIPAA records, it's really nice to start realizing you can have one hospital system with all the services and care you need, and everything is easily transportable inside that system. So we want people to start thinking about what their presence looks like, whether or not you're going to make a big commitment, to make some commitment at least.
Well, it also looks like we need to think about an affordable resource to crank out these images, because I certainly think of Instagram in a highly visual way, low copy, big image that communicate, you're communicating through video, you're communicating through still photography, that's really capturing the audience. I'm assuming that for smaller organizations, it's just a challenge to be able to capture this information or edit this information.
It is, but the interesting thing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, is using your information across media. There's a lot of evergreen information that you can bring up. We talk about heat waves every season. There are news things that will be very in the moment, and you can copy and paste or retweet, I should say, images from other sources, and you'll have a library. And in this era where every single person always has a cell phone, and pictures may or may not be as hard as we think. And if we ask people to self-populate, doctors, different staff, just like we saw with Roswell Cancer Clinic, there's a whole lot of kind of spontaneous pictures taken by staff, and it keeps it visual, keeps it fresh.
Do you have a point of view about the use of stock photography? Stock
photography is fine. It often looks like stock photography. I'm going to bet you anything that the image on the lower left corner here, that little 4-leaf clover, is stock photography, as may well be the top left and middle bottom images. I'm not sure, but they have that look. So stock photography is fine. I wouldn't overuse it just because other people are going to be using it as well. But there's nothing wrong with it. And having that library of stock photography in addition to your candid shots and more topical shots, there's no reason why not. What I do want to mention as well is you see again here, they have a lot of different Instagram accounts, just as they do on Twitter, but there's a bit of a missed opportunity in their branding. So where they're so good about #1 in the nation and you know where to go, they don't mention that even in text. And, that's just a shame because that's so strong. And I would love to see them replicate their branding tools here as well as on Facebook and Twitter. So this is, again, a local hospital. This is Vanderbilt Medical. And the text is really just a reflection of how much thought they put into their Instagram posts. But what they do, now I said you shouldn't chest beat, but this is a very interesting strategy. They focus on different individuals in the hospital and talk about their contributions to patient care. So it does make it feel very local. It does make it feel very personal. And it ranges from a nurse to doctors talking at a panel discussion. And I'm going to skip the furry guy for a second. In the top left is a lady from patient services, and then even a therapy dog who gets a shout out. So they make it real, they make it fun, and make you feel like when you walk into Vanderbilt Medical, you know who you're going to see.
So some of the lessons that we can take from Instagram are obviously this notion of visual channel, emphasizing the photos and videos. But you want to this last point that Johanna made, you want to have that brand consistency. You want to have those brand attributes. And you want to be able to address the different segments as well as link up with, this is another platform where you can synchronize with HCPs, synchronize with people in the community, where you can get some level of segmentation, which is, and I think our Facebook rep is close with Instagram, and they're beginning to look at hospitals, they're beginning to look at pharma, they're beginning to look at life sciences as categories to emphasize. So I think there's some flexibility in negotiation, there's some flexibility in design, there's some guidance and some best practices to be had directly from the platform. So I would encourage you, if you have a connection to Instagram, to mobilize it, because I think also there's a bunch of features. I think we're in a features and functions foot race along these platforms, and I think that there are opportunities to use these new features and functions in ways that are a little more precise and give us a little bit better targeting options. So with that in mind, the most disruptive player is TikTok, which has had a hockey stick growth and which has drawn some scrutiny from the government. I think there was a thing in the paper either yesterday or over the weekend where somebody in the Federal Trade Commission decided that TikTok is a national security risk. It's hard to imagine that the dancing nurses have provoked that, but there will be continued scrutiny on this, especially since it's owned by a Chinese company, which is also partly owned by the People's Liberation Army. So tell us about TikTok.
Well, you just told us a whole lot. That was an interesting segue. So TikTok is not a big favorite. The only one who's really made an investment is Cleveland Clinic, and we'll talk about it. And, you know, Danny, you mentioned visuals before when we were talking about Instagram, and I had a thought as you were saying it, which is that healthcare traditionally, and, you know, we know this, and I think everybody on this call does, has been a very verbal category, very dependent on language and regulations and the written word. But as the world moves toward more visual, again, nothing new to anybody here, videos are so much more important. Quick take visuals are going to be as much of a currency for marketing companies as language. So
funny you say that. I was talking to somebody yesterday about their health condition, and she said to me, "I don't want to give you the organ recital," which was a funny way of putting it. You know how older people always give you the catalog of their ailments, and I hadn't heard the formulation organ recital, but it struck me as being particularly apt and particularly funny.
Well, that's kind of, you know, we're going quicker and quicker as we look at social, and we glance at it and glance up and we multitask, and TikTok is starting to be the culmination of some of that. But you see the quote here, and I don't want to gloss over it. Medical Marketing and Media, this is pretty recent, says for many health-related brands, engaging with TikTok's high-energy content is essential. So let's talk about how Cleveland Clinic does that. So what they've done is so interesting. So the tabs for TikTok are on the left, and just like they've done, they have a ton of content. But again, they use the content in every channel. They just may frame it up a little differently or make it shorter for TikTok. So doesn't have to be dancing doctors. And frankly, it doesn't all have to be to 12 and 15-year-olds. That said, 12 and 15-year-olds have healthcare needs too. And just like American Express famously has targeted college students for years and years with their first offer for their first green American Express card, these kids are on TikTok. They're interested in health. There are a lot of young healthcare influencers who need the right content. And they're kids who need to go to their parents or trusted adults and talk about things. And this is one way to start those conversations.
Right. I've seen some research that shows that TikTok is a third, and a third, young people, middle-aged people, and older people. We've also had in our LiveWorld video series, a doctor named Chet Donnelly in Dallas who uses TikTok to recruit patients for spine surgery. So we're seeing a lot of individual things. I think one of the things that strikes me as funny is that in any population, you have people that have big egos or want to be media hot dogs, and TikTok seems to be the place for them. The other question I had for you, though, is, as you were talking, do you recommend a roadblock strategy where the message or the images across all the platforms are similar, as opposed to a distributed strategy where certain messages are on platform A, B, C, and D aimed at different targets?
That's such a good question. I think for evergreen content, it can be roadblock, but I think because of the slightly different nature of the channels, there's an argument to look at topicality differently for, say, Instagram and TikTok versus Facebook and Twitter, because certain things that are topical, for instance, about COVID, may be of more interest to more mature adults, less interest to kids, and vice versa. So I think it's something to think through, like a content library where you really can take some things and do a roadblock, as you suggested, and other things you might have the same content at different times. And then you might want to edit content a little more specifically for a younger audience. So a little bit nuanced there. I don't think you could go wrong with roadblocks if you're really engaging in the channel, but if you want to go that one step further, you can, really tailor it a little. I also want to point out that what Cleveland Clinic has done is so interesting. What you see on the right, they have a section on their website. So they're using TikTok to actually populate their website. So everything's kind of a self-contained universe. So you can see these feeds. They don't do this with their other social media, at least not yet. So they're using TikTok to show that they're not just for older people. They're using it to show they're innovative, that they're friendly to every type of consumer, that they get it. So it's as much a part of their branding as part of their content strategy. Now, again, we talked about this quite a bit. Targeting younger healthcare consumers is a real issue here. In the height of COVID, NYC's hospital network, which are 7 independent hospitals, got together and used TikTok to reach young people with a test and trace campaign. And the person you see here is an influencer with 3.2 million followers. And NYC Strong, he and several other New York City-based influencers used their reach to reach out to people for a very, very successful campaign to get young people to really engage in test and trace and getting vaccinated.
So our learnings from TikTok are that you can connect with an emerging healthcare audience. I should tell you that these guys are pretty flexible. Our tech team is working with TikTok to get access to the API. Our strategy team is working with TikTok to organize pharmaceutical kind of compliance, to help them understand HIPAA, to help them build structures that are friendly to communicators and that are compliant with regulations, and also to look at influencers and figure out a way to vet those influencers and to bring those influencers into harness. So those are capabilities that LiveWorld has that you're welcome to share. So let's go for the big recap. By now, you hopefully have seen some things that are useful. I think it's a no-brainer that every hospital needs to have some kind of social media presence. Both the staff and the potential patients kind of expect that. There's an opportunity to use social media to punch above your weight and to differentiate. Obviously, patient stories and medical specialties are core creative concepts, and investing in moderation. A number of our clients, Mass General, for example, we moderate their social media. We are able to help build community. We are able to generate competitive intelligence. We're able to identify pain points and issues among the patient population. We're able to recruit patients. So there's a number of case utilization tools that these platforms give us. And I would encourage you to look at the needs that you have as you begin to plan for 2023. And if we can be of help in helping you understand these platforms, sharing this information with your team, or helping you build an important strategy, please, all you have to do is ping us. So that's my shameless plug. You'll see in the console a variety of tools that are yours for the asking or for the taking. They include an ebook about TikTok. They include some guidelines. They include some ways that you can take some of these learnings and begin to fit them into your strategy, fit them into the audiences you need to reach, fit them into the employees and the organizations you need to serve. So with that in mind, we're going to go to questions and answers. And I'm going to turn it back over to our lovely moderator.
Thank you, Johanna and Danny, for a great presentation today. We'll now begin today's question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A chat box on your webinar console. Let's get started with the first question. What is the best way to moderate third-party posts and responses?
We do it with social listening. We target specific competitors. We target specific organizations. And we use both automated software and human intelligence. LiveWorld moderates and manages more than 300 pharma, life science, and hospital social properties. We have our own proprietary software. We have an agent pool of more than 150 people that can do this moderation in 70 different languages. So, you know, either you can do it yourself or you can do it with a partner. But it's certainly a valuable tool to understand what's going on in the market and to be able to, you know, we think of social media as kind of an ongoing conversation. So we use these various tools to be sure we understand, excuse me, what the conversation is and what the best possible way to participate it is.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. We have another question here. Someone asked, sometimes it feels like hashtags aren't particularly helpful. How do they really expand reach, and what hashtags are best practices?
Johanna, I'm going to let you take that one.
Sure thing. So hashtags are kind of interesting. They can be one-offs, right? So each of us, when we write a little Facebook post, we might make a clever hashtag. But they really can and should be strategic. So what you want with your hashtag is to have it repeated as people retweet or repost what you've shared. And that means being relevant. So NYU, for example, has a terrific hashtag for its brand that it never uses. And I'm really not sure why they don't include it in every post. Because if they did, it appears on their brand tile on top of their Facebook profile. So if they did that constantly and continuously, people would pick that up, and as their tweets are reposted or their Facebook posts are reposted, that hashtag would take on resonance and would be associated with it. It's true that, you know, we're tempted to do a special hashtag for any post. That's not a strategic use. It's basically taking whatever your main 2 or 3 objectives are, your main 2 or 3 areas that you want to draw focus to, and use the hashtag to draw focus to that area. So
yeah, I think you want to use a hashtag that's being used by other people, where there is an ongoing conversation. I know there's this ego thing of creating your own hashtag, but the reality is, if you're hashtagging a topic that other people are doing, you're going to get that traffic. One trick that I know our people do is they often search Twitter for hashtags in a particular category. So they might search oncology, develop a list of the hashtags which are active on the platform, and use one of those hashtags to tag their post. I think we're ready for the next question.
Yes, the next question here is, what is the best way to find accounts that are related to Cross?
You kind of cut off in the middle.
Yes, no problem. I can repeat that one. What is the best way to find accounts that are related to cross-post?
What do you think, Johanna?
So what I'm taking from that question is that if somebody is cross-posting or reposting your material, how do you find them? Do we think that's the question that's being asked? Because it's fairly straightforward then to look at your feed and see where you're being mentioned. So if you look at notifications in your feed line, it will show you where your posts and who's been posting with your information on it. But I may be oversimplifying, and I'm not sure I answered the question properly.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
We have another question here. What are some good strategies for addressing comments made on social media that are directly opposing or combating your hospital? How do you address hate speech?
That's huge. Danny, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Yeah, I think you acknowledge it. I think that everybody, nobody's perfect. Everybody has flaws. Everybody has a bad day. Everybody has some anomalies in their system. So A, I think you acknowledge it. B, I think you reach out to that individual. And part of that's a strategy decision, whether you reach out to that individual on the platform in a public way or whether you DM that person to get the chapter and verse. But I think you need to be responsive to that. The other idea that I've had for a long time is that it's perfectly okay to have criticisms on your feed, on your post. It makes you real. Nobody's perfect. Nobody wants to kind of suppress every alternative thought. So again, I think that's where a skilled community manager or a skilled moderator can organize that. The other thing that we classically do with our clients, certainly our moderation clients, is we build response libraries. So we look at the most frequently asked questions. We look at the most frequently raised objections. We try to be pretty critical of ourselves. We think of all the possible criticisms of our organization, and we pre-program answers to them so that we can A, be responsive in the moment, and B, anticipate a downrange conversation.
Danny, it makes me think that, and I want to get to something else in the question in a second, but a great role model for that is the hospitality industry, where you will often see on ratings, for either Airbnbs or hotels or airlines, you name it, a bad experience. And when the response is done right, it's often just, Danny, what you were saying, somebody really compassionately talking about that experience and looking for ways to make it right. Now, the second part of that question, they use the words hate speech, and that to me is a different category. There's complaints and criticism, but if it's true hate speech, then there's a question of going to the platform moderator and figuring out if it's a troll, if it's a distressed human being, and trying to dig in under that. But that person will have to be blocked most likely, and based on the rules of the platform. So if it's true hate speech, that's a separate issue to me.
Right, and in fact, we in our work for Mount Sinai, not only do we have a protocol for hate speech and for raising it, we also have a protocol for reporting it to law enforcement when somebody makes a threat or somebody suggests some violence in some way or shape or another. So I think you want to have the moderation done by people that are professional moderators. You want to have the right skill set. You want to have the right software. You want to prepare yourself with a response library and escalation protocols.
Thank you both for your insights there. Another question here is, what metrics do you track? How do you measure success?
Well, it partly depends on what we're doing. We obviously look at traffic. We obviously look at conversion if there's a call to action. We also look at the intensity of the conversation. Are people commenting? Are people retweeting? So a lot of the KPIs are based on particular tactical objectives. Do we want to recruit knee surgery patients? And then the answer is, did we get any? So there's a variety of KPIs that we look at tailored to marketing strategies and then tailored to the platform that we're working on.
Thank you for that. There's a couple more questions here. Someone asked about HIPAA regulations and how to go about those as they post content.
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward. You can't publish or post any personally identifiable information. We have again, at LiveWorld, we have a seminar that we do for our clients to teach them about HIPAA and to make them sensitive to this issue of privacy, which is increasingly being discussed in the public sphere and probably the subject of some additional regulation coming down the line.
But Danny, there are ways to get patients. Oh, just the thought was that, Danny, I just wanted to mention with all the emphasis we've done on patients and patient stories, there are protocols to work with specific individual patients to make sure that their stories are amplified in the correct way.
Right, and that we have a release from them. We have permission to use them. We never give out any personal details, but we could say Mary had a successful knee surgery, and she would give her own testimonial.
Thank you for those helpful guidelines. Any suggestions on how to balance a more conservative brand with edgy content that patients want to read?
One of the things that I would love to talk to that brand about, just hypothetically, but I would ask that brand to think about is, what does conservative mean? And what does it mean when your patients experience your brand, your hospital? So edgy content in and of itself may not be your brand, but you may want to find ways that are appropriate for your tone, in the same way that the New York Times and the Onion might have very different approaches to people who want to read news. Then you might have, for your brand, a more appropriate way to talk. And rather than chasing a trend, use the channels available and the content you have to be appropriate to the way you want to be seen and the experience you want people to have in your organization. So you can use tools like quizzes and videos and even TikTok, but not necessarily go out over an edge that your brand is not comfortable with.
I would add to that to focus on the capabilities of your institution. So if you're great in pediatrics, talk pediatrics. If you're great in orthopedics, talk orthopedics. If you've got a great cancer center, if you're a heart-friendly institution, that you don't need dancing doctors, you don't need to do wild graphics, you don't need to do flashy stuff, but to focus on the core attributes of your organization and use those as subject matter for the content that you create. I know we're coming up on time, so let's take one more question.
Sure, yeah. The last one here is someone had a question about LinkedIn not being included and was wondering if it is an extension of Facebook or how can they implement LinkedIn into their social media practices.
So LinkedIn, we don't think of as a typical consumer channel. LinkedIn is very much about your employees and your prospective employees, and perhaps your vendors and other partners. So we didn't include it because it's not the type of outreach where we would imagine a hospital would go to connect with patients on a relationship basis. It is a very valuable tool. It has huge value in terms of the areas I just suggested, in terms of recruiting, in terms of shaping perceptions of your organization as a great place to work, in terms of sharing company news and differentiating yourself as an audience to those audiences. So it's a sort of a separate objective and a separate strategy, but it's a terrific channel.
And it's an especially good channel for reaching HCPs and distributing clinical information. Given the changes in targeting that Facebook and Instagram have, LinkedIn, certainly on the business-to-business side, or what we would call the HCP side, we're still able to target by specialty, by medical degree, by geography. So from a targeting perspective, LinkedIn has great value. The other thing that's interesting about LinkedIn, though, is that it is an incidental usage channel. I don't know what your experience has been, but I've sent messages to people on LinkedIn and who don't look at LinkedIn the way they look at Facebook every day. They look at LinkedIn once in a blue moon. So at the top of the month, I'll send somebody a note. I won't get a response for 3 weeks because she didn't look at LinkedIn every day. Now, LinkedIn is trying to change that. Microsoft has rejiggered a lot of their strategic marketing and commercial policies. They are actively trying to monetize the platform. But to Johanna's point, it's not efficient to reach out to potential patients. So I want to thank everybody for your time. I appreciate your willingness to join with us today and unpack this research. The material will be shared with you. And if there's anything that we at LiveWorld can do to help you, either in terms of your brand planning, in terms of sharing this material with your team, in terms of tactical or strategic thinking about some of these lessons and how they might work out for your institution, all you have to do is ping me at Danny@LiveWorld. So again, thank you for your time. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye, everybody. Stay well.